I'm going to focus now on the role of the visiting board. I'm going to drill down, and some of it might seem a bit homemade and apple pie, but I make no apologies for that. I think accreditation can be simplified, and some of the messages are probably pretty obvious. Gerald mentioned it was 10 years since I was apparently speaking elsewhere on this campus. I was going to mention it's 50 years since Martin Luther King made his famous dream speech, but, you know, heck. I didn't realize I was in such good company, but it is actually 50 years ago to the day. What I'm going to present here is a bit of a personal view. It's going to refer to SACAP, it's going to refer to CAA, but it's not going to be domain specific. It roams a little bit, and you'll see some of the illustrations are from Korea, I think from China, from most places, Singapore and so on. So some of them are RIBA visits, some are from other authorities, some of them are CAA. So if you think some of the people don't look very Commonwealth, they probably aren't. They come from all over the world. But I've had the privilege to witness and take part in a number of accreditation visits for a very great number of years. I've also still got the marks of the knives in my back from being a head of school when I had to field various visiting boards. I think 6 in all over 27 odd years. And, you know, it's a painful business, and you do learn a few things on the way, but if it's done rigorously, it can actually be for the health and betterment of the school. I really believe that the work that goes on prior to a visit, when schools actually begin to consider what they believe are the things they must focus on and what are the things that are most important to them, and the message that they convey, is probably as important as the visit itself. I'll take a race at this because some of it I've had sort of stolen by Gerald in a lighter way, but that's the scope I'm going to cover, from the purpose of validation through to good practice and how we evaluate the evidence when we go on site, how to reach consensus, writing the report and so on. I make no apologies for putting this Hollywood image of the architect up there. It's obviously Gary Cooper from the 1949 Fountainhead film. But this notion of the architect who has these total competencies to do everything, standing in front of this building, his comprehensive design project, might seem archaic, but actually the model of architectural education has remained much the same. In fact, we've probably got better at listing more and more competencies as we think about them, to the point where there is a danger in that we're expecting too much of individuals. But the notion of those who graduate on a professional track having certain abilities is still fundamental to the business of a school, and the fundamental business of validation is to go and check that they're actually doing it. So maybe Gary Cooper's not so far different from 2013. So what is SACAP CAA validation? The granting of approval to a course which has been tested and found to produce results of a minimum acceptable standard against set criteria. Often in shorthand talked about as an output-related model. You don't look at the number of lecture theatres, you look at the quality of the student work. And let's kick away the semantic differences that were referred to earlier. The word accreditation is often used in other parts of the world, and I know people argue about the semantic differences, but they're more or less the same. Professional validation is probably slightly different in that it's an evidence-based, peer-reviewed evaluation of courses in architecture. that comes from without. It's not organised by the university. It's not organised necessarily by national processes elsewhere. I know that's slightly different in South Africa. But it's recognitions of qualifications rather than individuals. The origin, in a sense, of a validation system was avoid everybody having to trape off to, I don't know, Johannesburg to take a single exam on a single day. That's what used to happen in the UK. Everybody would trape off to the RIBA and have an exam, and if you failed, you failed. Delegating that checking over a longer period of time through the life of a student and making sure that by the time they get to the degree or the final qualification prior to being let out on the world has been given to the universities rather than to the professional institutes. But the process of professional validation is a way of overlooking to make sure that those standards are still acceptable. I won't read all these out, but the green book you have in front of you certainly will regurgitate to the formal purpose of CA validation, and it's slightly different from SACAP, which has a legal underpinning to it. Validation for the CAA was always intended as a common currency between Commonwealth countries, some who had no architecture schools, some had many, some had only one. But it seemed a useful way of establishing a benchmark to make available then to national authorities a list of those qualifications in architecture that CAA could recommend. It was always by recommendation, and the invitation to validate was always by invitation for recognition. So it's a way of having this common currency as the academic requirements prior to, given different words in different countries, license, registration, or acting as an architect, sometimes with additional requirements, obviously. But there are other informal purposes of validation. It has the intent of trying to not just check standards, but raise standards internationally, and also to improve the knowledge and skills in education, research and practice in a transcultural global context, as was quoted by Sir Robert Matthew in Jaco's excellent presentation. I think it was interesting looking back at those quotes from Sir Robert Matthew, which I think were at a meeting in Nigeria in the late 60s. But the institution of visiting boards actually on location as a concept was new to the world, and CAA was the first. It predated the RIBA ones, and I hadn't realised that. So I put that down just to make the point that the CAA got in there before the RIBA. And of course the RIBA one is run by people all from the UK, whereas CAA is this partnership role. This picture, I think, is in the 70s. You can tell from the ties and the lapels. I think in York. So what is the validation board's authority and reach? And I'm going to just compare CAA on this slide with SACAP on this slide. They're slightly different. So the marriage will have tensions, but not without some fruitful outcomes, I hope. CAA's main benefit, I suppose, is that original idea of being something that is international. I mentioned it was by invitation agreement. It has no legal underpinning. It is entirely voluntary. It has no authority. And some people say, well, what's the point? And that might be something we could talk about this afternoon. But for those institutions or those organisations that don't have international links, it's quite good to have the rear mirror view internationally rather than nationally. And of course, it links with the Canberra Accord. And there are some other aims that are listed down there, including diversity and so on. Whereas if one looks at SACAP, recognised nationally, although it recommends compatibility of qualifications internationally, and I know that Gerald and Phil have been to various Canberra meetings and are looking around this region to see how things are done. So there's certainly no insularity in SACAP from the top. It's how that might transmute into changing the system if change is needed. It has the legal authority that we heard from Phil, and the main objective is to determine whether graduates meet prescribed minimum national standards for the category of registration concerned. And it's a very systematic system, and you probably know it better than me. So what is the remit of the visiting board? Checking standards is the remit, and it has joint standards to meet. Those of CAA, and I'll come back to those later, and some from SACAP. Question of one's called competencies, and one's called criteria. But it's also about checking that the delivery of the courses is fair and appropriate, has assessment regimes. It's unbelievable, but I have been on visiting boards where you go into schools and there is absolutely no common agreement about how assessment takes place. Individual professors hiving off and doing their own thing, you know. It's also an objective view of whether the school can actually fulfill its mission. So I summarize where I began. The visit is intended to stimulate critical self-analysis. It's not about what Phil Mashabane said, the fear of the visiting board coming to tell you how to do things. A visiting board should very much be in a listening mode and in very much hearing what the school is about. It's not intended as a means, in my view, for the profession to punish a school. This is my list of good practice protocols. Add to it or argue with them if you feel so. Obviously, some of them have been mentioned. Confidentiality, punctuality. Avoiding early views is terribly dangerous. And this one is a must. Avoid comparing to other schools. I've certainly been on visiting boards, I'm sure others have, when a crusty academic will say, well, we wouldn't do it that way in my school, and I really feel my blood boil when I hear that sort of view. Nothing to do with it. You're not looking at your school, you're looking at someone else's school, and you're judging them against external criteria, not your own. So avoid bringing prejudicial baggage. Terribly difficult when you're in day-to-day other things, but when I was a student 30 years ago, has no relevance. It's always been a good school. I've heard recently that so-and-so, etc. You've probably heard it, and there is nothing more gossipy than the academic machinery in any country. Nothing is more backbiting. And it is difficult if you've come from one institution and you're jealous of another or you have views about another to leave it at the school gate. You have to. And I think that's what determines a professional. You go in with the criteria and competencies as your bedrock, and it's that you're looking at, and if it's done differently, and if it's done well, that's all that matters. And judgment should be based on student work. It's certainly not on how many good fruit machines there are or what the quality of the upholstery is in the lecture theatres. I've seen some of the best work come out of lousy conditions, and I've seen some awful work come out of very good buildings. I think the other thing, which is a reminder chairs should always make, is that although you're in to check lowest standards, don't let that be the only thing you do. You're also trying to see what an average student can do and enjoy and hopefully have an interesting and a good educational journey. So apply objectivity, and about resources, only if they are in some way impeding academic standards should they become some kind of concern that's written about. CAA has had in the past arguments with different parts of the world who go around looking at how many computers, how many lecture theatres, and stressing resources rather than outcomes. And I think that's something that we would wish to discourage. This question of conflict of interest is one that I think is particularly difficult and relevant in South Africa. It is true that you have a smaller pool. It is true that people, as they do in other larger systems, reappear with different hats on. I think probably where we would say from the CAA, we would draw the line that if an external examiner has been examining in a school recently, they should not be on that board. There should be at least a 5-year gap. we can talk about this. It might be that we've got this wrong. It might be that to have that intelligence in the board is useful. In my judgment, it can cloud objectivity in terms of a validation panel. Let's just turn to what we might do as validators to make our validating better and more reliable. I mean, prior to the visit, you get documentation. I think it's beholden upon individuals to read it properly. I have, on occasions, chaired boards when I'm quite convinced nobody's read the documentation, but we then get told to go and do homework. CAA has a Skype conversation to go through the documents and make sure we're comfortable with it. And then, of course, the afternoon before the visit is that really crucial visit that Gerald mentioned, where the chair must take hold and identify matters that have been drawn from the reading that we wish to pursue over the next few days, and to allocate tasks for different board members. So I see this meeting, which is outside the 2 days, 3 days, as being really a cornerstone. I won't repeat what Gerald's already said, but it is essential for everybody to be present, and it is essential for the chair to remind everybody that we're there to look at the work against particular criteria, maybe even go through the criteria to make sure people have read it. Sometimes I get the feeling that some boards haven't read what the current criteria are. And I think it's that point where you draw down from people whether or not they're familiar with the documentation and have identified those things that are missing, that we want to identify and go on towards. So what are the key points for doing it well on the days that follow? I think silence is the best thing. Listen, not tell. Try to be consistent. Look at the program balance. Look at not just design, but the subject folios. Look not just at the work, but the feedback assessments. Look at the sheets that show the position of those students in the top, middle, and lower. Make sure that the folios are actually what the school is saying they are. And to go through the usual things of ensuring that all the bits and pieces are in place for that school to deliver its mission. That's on paper. You're going to see that they actually do it. You want to be sure that there are enough people on the ground to deliver what the school says it is. So you are interested in staff capabilities, but in a sense, that without the other things is not going to deliver a good program. I think the second bullet is probably the one I would pause on and plead that visiting boards in this country take stock of. I think each school ought to have its own distinguishing features, its own academic character, to do with its locale, to do with the people who have research, who work in the institution, to do with the priorities of that school as it sees in its particular niche. Set against the universals of the minimum requirements, see whether that school has stated what it's about, and then relate it to the SACAP and CA criteria translated for that school. You're obviously looking to see where improvements can be made. You're looking to see the board standing in terms of strengths, weaknesses, whether the past standard is adequate, and whether there's remedial action. And in terms of the balance of the board, we talked about this. I had a difficulty when SACAP thought it should only be practitioners. I am pleased to see now that academics are now part of the structure. I honestly think that a few more wouldn't harm, but maybe that's what CAA could bring. I think what we try to do in direct visits with CAA is get a balance between academics and practitioners, get a balance between male and female. We're not good at that, but getting better. Trying to get an age balance is terribly difficult if you're looking for people with experience. But these things are all things to challenge us, and the CAA system is certainly not perfect, but it does try and represent the world as it is, not as we would wish to see it, probably. I think the idea of a continuity person is very good, so that when you go to a school, either the chair is back as a panel member, or one of the original panel members is on the next visit is good. I know that's happened. I can see at least one person in the room who has done that in visiting boards I've been aware of. So let's just look at these different components of the visiting board and see what their responsibilities are. They're slightly different. Obviously we've got the chair, he's got particular priorities. CAA's got its priorities and SACAP has got its responsibilities. We've also got this student or recent graduate, and I agree with Gerald, our experience is that recent graduates with a couple of years of work or a year, looking back, are slightly better in terms of how they operate. We've not had a great deal of joy of bringing co-professionals along, although it's happened occasionally, and the secretary, paid secretaries have been extremely useful in the last few years. The chair is crucial to the good running of a board, and if anything, one of the training sessions I would recommend to SACAP would be just to get past chairs in a room and to ask, how was it for you? You know, what are the lessons we could learn? What aid memoirs do I need? What manuals do I need to help guide me on what I'm meant to do? Because they exist in other countries. I'm not sure whether there is one here. One gets the feeling that chairs are looking at their own experience and hoping that will see them through. And I think if some of that experience could be shared, it would be very useful. He's the one that brings the visiting board together, and he makes sure that we stay on message, that it's about getting access and evaluating admissible evidence, not the I've heard that, but the information you're given, the meetings you attend and you hear stuff, and the students' work. It's what you hear, it's what you read, and what you see. And it's hearsay and history are not admissible evidence. It's about the school now, not in the past. So Chair sees to that, and he's obviously leading meetings, and has that overview that sees validation as a way of helping improve if improvement is necessary. And it's about academic standards at the end of the day, but equally it's about the quality of the student experience. It's great having good work, but if everybody hated the experience and can't wait to get off to another university for the second part of their education, that doesn't say much for the time any students spent there. I'll let you read these, but the chair's role obviously is the maitre d', if you like, of making introductions, ensuring confidentiality, and making sure that procedures are followed. The secretary and the chair between them really should be sure that SACAP's current policies, current procedures are applied and the current criteria applied. I think if there are questions to be fed back to the school, it's important that it always goes by the chair, always goes by the secretary. It's always important to agree questions ahead of meetings, not at the meetings, so that each person within the board is taking with them to a meeting, questions that have been agreed before, which are actually clarifying points that have come out of the student work or from the documentation. Meetings on the hop will not glean that information. And of course the chair reminds the board that it is responsible, not him alone, for writing the report. However, these two handsome characters, representing one chair I had the delight to work with and a secretary I had the privilege to be in a visiting board with, they, between them, make sure that the process is applied properly, speculative comments are avoided, and proper procedures are followed. However, the board members, they get on with the work and make sure that they scrutinise the work in front of them. For CAA, only 2 people, but one in region, out region. They ensure that CAA's criteria are followed in compliance with a direct visit, and they will write a parallel report. I think that's a nuisance. I wish it wasn't so, but I think for CAA's integrity, it wishes to be able to stand up in front of Canberra Court and say, yes, we have been and seen, we can count this degree from Pretoria, Free State, wherever, as being equivalent, substantially equivalent to those others that are recognised under Canberra Court. To have an independent report which could technically come to a different decision, but hopefully never, is what we would wish to have at the moment. So what is the role of SACAP members? Obviously, 2 academics, 4 practitioners, 1 learner, answerable to SACAP, primarily to check that SACAP's competence for the architectural professions are met for the appropriate category. It endorses CAA criteria. They are bound into the Purple Book. And I've got here non-negotiable, as Gerald pointed out, that at least the main decisions, the main recommendations are signed off. And certainly on the visit that I went to recently, that was done very carefully. The authorship was jointly done, and it was signed off by the head before that board left. The CAA tends to write its report afterwards, simply for logistical reasons. Here's Brendan, a recent graduate, no, actually student on a recent visit. He brings, or the recent graduate brings, relevant experience of what it's like to be a student in 2013 or thereabouts. And this avoids the problem of, say, some practitioners only being able to refer mentally to when they were students, or for academics only being able to refer to their experience in their school. And of course, students can engage informally with students and ask the kind of things that are going on in terms of the student experience, the learning experience, what is going on. Secretary takes minutes, ensures procedures are kept, helps collate the draft, helps the final editing. In independent CA visits, that would be a CA person. Here, obviously, in South Africa, that would be a SACAP person. Now, this next bit is about the evidence, tracking it, evaluating it, triangulating it. This is if you like, the centerpiece, and if we've got it wrong, then everything else goes wrong, but it's about the evidence. So how can we be sure when we read, look and listen, we read the documentation, we look at the student work, and we hear what's said in meetings, that evidence fulfills the criteria? And for me, you have to triangulate that. You look at your external validation criteria, be familiar with it. You look at the school's learning outcomes for the various levels and for the various elements, and hopefully they have mapped where those criteria they believe meets the learning outcome. And you view the student outputs, the actual physical evidence, and check whether they demonstrate meeting the criteria. So think of the triangulation: external criteria, learning outcomes, and student outputs. There should be a link between the three. If there isn't, given that we have to accept the validation criteria, then something is wrong with either the learning outcomes or the student outputs. Your job is to find out which or both. To make it easier, I've just put in smaller writing. You may not be able to read that, but the school would map in a matrix or a similar document how they believe their learning outcomes at the different levels meet the criteria. It's very useful as either a validator or an examiner going into a school. If you've got a matrix in front of you, you can check very quickly the proportion of design to other subjects. CAA, for instance, says that it believes there should be about 50% of design matter, 50% other matter. Quite difficult to define the smudgy in between, but it's a guide. We're also interested to see that there's a significant difference between what CAA calls Part 1 and what is Part 2. I'll come back to that in a little while. How do you interpret the evidence? Does the triangulation reveal consistency, legibility, appropriate level in terms of delivery of courses, appropriate fare assessment regimes, and so on. Does it meet all the SACAP criteria? Track, triangulate, interpret, map the evidence, checking whether there's a significant difference between Part 1 and Part 2. We call Part 1 is initial first degree, Part 2 advanced level, usually 3+2. Different models are in operation, but you should be looking for a clear distinction between the first degree and the second, between Parts 1 and Part 2, in terms of aspiration, in terms of intellectual agenda. Part 2 should be seen as a more ambitious, more intellectual, enhanced standards than the Part 1. And it should be, at least whatever system, the jumping off point towards a professional track. It's true that our first degree may actually be not just for people who want a professional track. My personal view is we shouldn't be dealing with first degrees at all. I've argued for 25 years we should get out of that business. Universities are much better at it than validators. I think our professional role should be looking at the leaping off point at Part 2. But there we are. Point for discussion this afternoon. Should we be involved in first degrees? Personal view, no. I have argued vigorously about this, and there are views both ways. So, viewing the evidence, viewing the documentation, is the written documentation objective, particularly this self-appraisal, critical self-appraisal. Is there a forward vision? Is it complete? And out of that, are there some issues to be explored? I put here digital or hard copy because I think this is a recurring theme. You know, schools say, can we send it all digitally? I think the answer is a lot of it can be, but certain items are best to have in a way that you can write notes on as you go around. So again, we might want to debate that this afternoon. Viewing the exhibition. This one happens to be in Singapore. The exhibition is about clarity, about whether a distinctive character is coming through. Looking at the portfolios on the left is in Auckland, New Zealand, beautifully laid out in terms of colour coding the different levels and the different standards. Looking at the design folios, you're looking for that coordinated iterative experience, project by project, year by year. And this question of integration of support subjects. I think the other thing that we often find missing is preparatory work. I'll come back to that later. And then you're checking against the standards as always. Support subjects mustn't be overlooked. You expect subject files, you expect to see essays, examination scripts. You're looking for clarity of learning objectives. Again, checking workload, checking criteria. Gerald meant the meeting of the VC. I think it should be no more than 12.5 minutes personally, but sometimes you can't stop VCs wanting to tell you things, but it's probably up to the chair to be graceful in a reasonably expeditious way. The VC will have his agenda, but those are the things that you're really looking for. You're looking for the context within which your visit takes place. However, the meeting with the senior staff at the beginning is much more interesting. It's about seeing whether you believe those that lead the school have the clarity of purpose for that distinctive character of the school to be delivered, and that they meet you as fellow professionals and can talk about their school in an intelligent way. They should also use that session as a way of explaining their particular assessment regime. Each school seems to have a different one, and to explain how the exhibition and the folios are laid out. The meeting with the external examiners, I think, is extremely important. We heard that the Americans don't have that benefit. I can understand why. Certainly, in my estimation, bringing people back into the school and to hear in private conversation what were the recurring themes during their time seems to be a very useful way of checking that year by year, comments that have been made have been picked up, advice has been adhered to or not, discussion has taken place, and that the future direction of school is clear. I think when you're meeting staff, my experience is having the head there or not doesn't seem to make a lot of difference, but There has been a convention of keeping heads out. I think rotating heads are such that now it's probably not an issue as it was in the past when heads once appointed never left, you know, and sometimes were overbearing, and I'm not sure that's the case these days. But what you're hoping for is an open-ended, discursive conversation where views are expressed, and hopefully you elicit more about some of those things that you were worried about in the documentation. So you're testing whether the critical self-appraisal is an accurate reflection of the school, or if it was written by one person, just one of the members who wrote it. I think those two bullets are important. You know, is that meeting with staff showing a cohesive or a divided body? You all know what I mean. And is it confident or does it sound guarded? If it's confident and it's cohesive, one expects that the school probably works like that when you're not there. Meetings with students can be of varying kinds. The one on the bottom is Uganda. The one at the top isn't. But I think you need at least 20 students, but more is better. I think it's good that students come with a list of questions or comments or topics. If they want to give you a private written document, I think that's fine. But the main purpose of those usually very entertaining meetings, because they get better as time goes on with the meeting, is to try and gauge whether the student experience is a good one, whether they value the learning environment and the pastoral care that they're receiving. After all those meetings, it's absolutely essential that we have a kind of wrap-up to decant the key things, get the secretary to make notes, to let that be a kind of guiding idea for the report, but also guide for other meetings. I think it's not good just to go straight into the next meeting without having time to reflect, because it's sometimes useful that different people hear different things, and I think it's quite good to get a consensus. I've said something about resources before, but gauge only in terms of adequacy of course delivery. Quantity and quality is only of interest if it's impeding standards. I put this one at the bottom: beware schools that want visiting boards to endorse a school's wish list. You're not there to do that. You're there to look at academic standards, not to argue with the VC for more computers. So don't be impressed or underwhelmed. CAA validation criteria we've referred to. SACAP competencies you know, and they are now closely aligned with CAA. Reaching consensus is more difficult. It's up to the chair to remind what the different outcomes are. I notice in the new purple book there is a tick list where the chair could go through and absolutely pin down whether or not criteria have been met. That sounds a bit pedantic, but in a way it's a useful reminder that you're not there just in some arbitrary way thinking the wind's blowing in the right direction. You are actually there to check. I think if there is general concern about a number of criteria, you might wish to ponder on that. And I agree absolutely with Gerald, conditional validation should be an exception. A very, very rare exception where standards haven't been met. And if you ever are in that position, make sure that in writing what are the conditions and the time for putting right those conditions, that it's done in an absolutely clear way. I have read reports where it's rather unclear. Absolute need for consistency, and I will read this out because it endorses the view that we've heard other speakers. Given the same evidence, any visiting board should come to the same view if the process has been rigorous and consistent. If the people have been trained properly, if they go there with the same documentation and they look at the same evidence, they should come to the same view. I'm not sure that's the view that schools have in every country, because schools need to have that confidence in a robust and reliable system if they're going to trust it. I love these two slides. South Africa, it's reporting back to students, the informality of South Africa versus the formality of Korea, but there are two different ways of doing it. But in one way or another, the reports decisions are read to or reported back to the head of school and senior staff, and then to the whole school, and occasionally to the VC. Writing the report is not an option, it is a tough job, and to get it right, chair delegates various elements, and then hopefully the secretary and chair collate and edit and get rid of the odd apostrophe in the wrong position and make sure that we have something that looks as though it's been written by the same hand. I mentioned earlier that the CAA writes a parallel report. I put this up just as a final slide to say that when the board finishes its visit on site, if the board hasn't written nearly all of the report, there is a danger that the secretary, the chair, the board members and the CA people disappear, and then it becomes difficult. The more you can do on site, the better. But there is a little bit of editing that's usually done, and to make it kinder on the chair and secretary who struggle with this, it's essential, if you're on a board, to make sure that your bit of the report is signed off. You do coordinate by email to ensure that everything's consistent, well written, and as you agreed. There was one famous visit that was referred to where the secretary chose to write the thing independently of what the decisions were. I mean, that's the worst extreme. That doesn't happen anymore. But, you know, on a sensible matter, please be sure that you don't think leaving the school is the end of your job. It continues. We are now into discussion period. Thank you.